Hey guys, this will be video 2 for AP Euro on Monday, March 30th. The relationship between Charles and the Parliament got off to a bad start when Parliament granted him tonnage and poundage custom duties for a one-year period rather than life for the monarch, as had been the custom since the 15th century. Charles, however, was committed to the war against Spain, so he cashed in his wife's dowry and sent an expedition to the Spanish port of Cadiz. The mission was a complete failure. To pay for these military disasters, Charles requested a forced loan from wealthier subjects. So several members of Parliament refused to pay this loan and were thrown in jail. Parliament was called again in 1628, at which time it put forward a petition of rights, which Charles felt forced to sign. It included provisions that the king could not demand a loan without the consent of Parliament, and that Parliament must be called frequently. The petition also prohibited individuals from being imprisoned without published cause, and the government from housing soldiers and settlers in private homes without their owners' permission. Finally, it outlawed using marital laws against civilians, which Charles had used to collect his forced loans. In August 1628, Charles's chief minister, the dashing but incompetent Duke of Buckingham, was murdered by an embittered sailor who blamed him for England's recent military disasters. Charles, on the other hand, blamed the leaders of the House of Commons, most notably John Eliot, for inflaming passions against Buckingham. When Parliament was again called in 1629, both sides felt the issue of exclusive rights would lead to a conflict between Parliament and the King. In March of 1629, the issue came to the foreground when Eliot proposed three resolutions. 1. High churchmen and anyone suspected of popery should be branded as capital enemies of the state, meaning practicing Catholicism. 2. Any of the king's advisors who recommended that he raise funds without Parliament's approval should be tried as capital enemies of the state. 3. Anyone who paid tonnage and poundage, which the king was still illegally collecting, would be betraying the liberties of England. After hearing these demands, which he thought outrageous, the king summoned the Speaker of the House of Commons and ordered him to dissolve Parliament. 2 members of Parliament held the Speaker in his chair, a treasonable act because it disputes the right of the king to dissolve Parliament. Once Eliot's resolutions were passed, the king's messengers announced that he had dissolved Parliament. For the next 11 years, what is known as the personal rule of Charles was the law of the land. Charles decided to govern England without a calling of Parliament. Charles could have carried this office successfully and brought about the end of Parliament, as occurred in France during the same period of time. The major problem of how to raise enough revenue was solved by extending collection of ship money throughout the kingdom, a politically explosive decision. Traditionally, certain coastal cities were responsible for raising funds for naval defense during times of national emergency. 1634, Charles declared an emergency, although England was at peace. And 2 years later, he extended this tax to inland cities and counties, areas that had never before paid ship money. This was such a substantial source of income that it could possibly have freed the king from having to call Parliament again. By 1637, Charles was at the height of his power. He had a balanced budget, and his government policies and restructuring appeared to be effective. Yet within 4 years of this peak, the country would be embroiled in civil war. Charles ultimately ruined his powerful position by insisting that Calvin of Scotland adopt not only the episcopal structure of the Church of England, but also follow a prayer book based on the English Book of Common Prayer. The Scots wrote and signed a national covenant that pledged their allegiance to the king, but also vowed to resist all changes in their church. 1640, Charles called an English Parliament for the first time in 11 years because he believed it would be willing to grant money to put down the Scottish Rebellion. This became known as the Short Parliament because it met for only 3 weeks. Oops. Sorry. Pushed the wrong button. And was dissolved after it refused to grant funds prior to Charles addressing their own grievances. Charles was still determined to punish the Scots. After he dissolved Parliament, he patched together an army with the resources he could muster. The Scots were the victors on the battlefield and invaded northern England. They refused to leave England until Charles signed a settlement and in the meantime forced them to pay £850 per day for their support. To pay this large sum, Charles was forced to call another parliament. This became known as the Long Parliament because it met for an unprecedented 20 years. The House of Commons launched the Long Parliament by impeaching Charles's 2 chief ministers, the Earl of Strafford and Archbishop Laud, who were both executed in the 1640s. Parliament abolished the king's prerogative courts, like Henry VIII's Court of the Star Chamber, which had become tools of royal absolutism. Tensions grew even higher when a rebellion broke out in Ireland, which had been ruled with a strong hand since the time of the Tudors. Parliament took the momentous step of limiting some of the king's prerogative rights. They supported what was known as the Grand Remonstrance, a list of 204 parliamentary grievances from the past decade. They also made two additional demands that the king named ministers whom Parliament could trust, and that a synod of the Church of England to be called to reform the Church of England. In response, Charles tried to seize 5 of the leaders from the House of Commons. An attempt failed, resulting in Charles leaving London in January of 1642 to raise his royal standard in Nottingham. This marked the beginning of the English Revolution. So let's go to the Civil War. The English Revolution or the English Civil War. I don't know what's called revolution. During the initial stage of the English Revolution, things went poorly for Parliament. Their military commander, the Earl of Manchester, pointed out the dilemma when he noted, if we beat the king 99 times, he is still the king. But if the king defeats us, we shall be hanged and our property confiscated. Individuals such as Oliver Cromwell, who were far more dedicated to creating a winning war policy, soon replaced the early aristocratic leaders. It was Cromwell who created what was known as the New Model Army, a regularly paid, disciplined force with extremely dedicated Puritan soldiers. By 1648, the king was defeated, and in the following year, Cromwell was made the momentous decision to execute the king, a move that horrified most of the nation. But through a trial, it was not just like randomly. From 1649 to 1660, England was officially a republic, known as the Commonwealth. But essentially, it was a military dictatorship governed by Cromwell. Cromwell had to deal with the conflicts among his own supporters, such as a clash between the Independents and Presbyterians. The Independents, who counted Cromwell among their ranks, wanted a state church, but were also willing to grant a measure of religious freedom for others, although Catholics were to be excluded from the tolerance policy. On the other side of the divide were Presbyterians, who wanted a state church that would not allow dissent. Cromwell had also had to deal with the rise of the radical factions within his army, groups like the Levelers and Diggers, who combined their radical religious beliefs with a call for a complete overhaul of English society. They touted a philosophy that included such radical ideas as allowing men, not just those who own land, to vote for members of the House of Commons. Cromwell destroyed the Leveler elements in his army in 1649 after several regiments with large Leveler contingents revolted against his rule. In the following year, Cromwell led an army to Ireland, where he displayed incredible brutality in putting down resistance by supporters of the Stuarts. Cromwell would find, as Charles had earlier, that Parliament was a difficult institution to control. In 1652, he brought his army to London and dispersed the Parliament that dared to challenge him, only to replace them with the hand-selected individuals who had earned his displeasure within a matter of months. Over the next year, a group of many army officers wrote the Instrument of Government, the only written constitution in English history, and a document that provided the Republican government, the Protectorate, with a head of state holding the title Lord Protector, and a parliament based on fairly wide male suffrage. Cromwell stepped into the position of Lord Protector, but still found Parliament difficult to control. Finally, by 1655, Cromwell gave up all hope of ruling in conjunction with the legislature and divided England into 12 military districts, each to be governed by a major general. Okay. I'll finish this up. By the time Cromwell died and exhausted England wanted to bring back the Stuart dynasty, in 1660, the eldest son of the executed monarch became Charles II. The return of the Stuarts turned back to the clock to 1642, as the same issues that had led to the revolution against Charles' father remain unresolved. What is the proper relationship between the king and Parliament? What should be the religious direction of the Church of England? These issues were not fully addressed during Charles's reign, although they came to the forefront of the reign of his brother, Charles II, whenever he took the throne in 1685. Let's go over the key concepts. So period 2, it's also listed as unit 3 in the key concepts AP European course guidebook. Let's see, we're going to start off with topic 3.2, which is English Civil War and Glorious Revolution. The English Civil War, a conflict among the monarchy, parliament, and other elites over their respective roles in political structure, exemplified the competition for power among monarchs and competing groups. The outcome of the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution protected the rights of gentry and aristocracy from absolutism through assertions of rights of Parliament. I'm going to skip around some down to, I think it's 3.7. 7. Absolutist approaches. Absolute monarchies limited the nobility's participation in governments, but preserved the aristocracy's social position and legal privileges. Louis XIV and his finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, extended the administrative, financial, military, and religious control of the central state over the French population. And that's probably it. Let's check out Unit 4 just to make sure. Yeah, we're good. Okay, so we'll stop the second video there.